So I'm writing my PhD dissertation in continental philosophy, and one of the issues I tackle, both in my dissertation and in the classes I teach, is the problem of suffering, death, and the absurd. Like the existentialists, I find this to be the most fundamental issue of philosophy. It certainly is so for religion, and particularly Christianity, in that Christians believe that God is not just all good and all loving, but love itself. And yet, how could love make a world like this? This problem certainly isn't confined to Christianity or even to religion more generally. It's a problem that precedes religion and, in fact, gives rise to religion. Suffering and evil and death is just as problematic for the agnostic or the atheist, and it stands in opposition not only to religion, but to philosophy and science and all of human endeavor. By this, I mean that the problem that the theologians call evil and that the existentialists call the absurd is bigger than just why did God allow the Holocaust or why is there so much suffering in the world. It goes down to the very nature of reality. See, what we're really tackling when we confront the problem of evil and suffering is a question of whether life is or is not meaningless. If life, if the world, if existence itself is not meaningful, then forget religion, there is no way even to ground philosophy, science, or sanity. Camus and Sartre tell us that we can create our own meaning out of a meaningless world, but we are obviously part of the universe, and if we can create meaning, then reality is not meaningless, for we can breathe meaning into it. True meaninglessness, by definition, would be irredeemable. And this problem of meaninglessness, of the absurd, confronts all of us at some point or another. It is that maddening current that flows just beneath the familiarity of our daily lives, at any moment threatening to plunge us into the abyss. We are always just one car accident, one cancer diagnosis, one confrontation with malevolence away from being forced to confront the seeming senselessness of life and the knowledge that everything ends in loss and death and decay. But it's more than that. Suffering, evil, and death is only just scratching the surface. It is the high school version of the problem. We have eaten from the tree of knowledge and have awakened both to the beauty and the unfathomability of life. In our ascent, we have flown too close to the sun and have been left with confounding insecurity of knowing too much, of being too conscious. We have reached the dizzying heights of self-awareness, and we are left shouldering this unbearable weight of being. We hide this truth from ourselves, but it is still there lurking in the shadows. The greatest fear is not the fear of death, it is the fear of life. Evil and suffering is a problem inasmuch as it insists on a meaningless universe, inasmuch as it proclaims that being and existence are at strife, that being fundamentally desires what existence cannot and will not offer. And yet, one thing remains in Pandora's box: hope. For thousands of years, humanity has been vexed by this problem of evil and suffering. Yet within this problem lies a treasure greater than all the treasures of the world. For too long, humanity has lived in the shadow of the abyss. Heidegger calls man being towards death. But on the other side of this paradox lies a new mode of being. To solve the problem would be to usher in a new kind of human, a new creation, or in a Hegelian sense, the first return to itself in truer form. To that end, I tackle the problem of evil and suffering. But in this video, rather than addressing the problem directly, which I do in my writing, what I want to do instead is respond to some of the main ideas circulating in popular discourse. While I critique both the agnostic and religious argument, I'm obviously on the side of a meaningful universe. I say obviously because to be human is to desire meaning. We are creatures of meaning and for meaning and from meaning, and love is the greatest meaning of all. This first set of clips is from the Sean McDowell show, where the Christian apologist William Lane Craig reacts to the agnostic Alex O'Connor on the Diary of a CEO podcast. The last two clips come from the Christian apologist, Dr. Frank Turek.
I would ask you to consider what you find more likely if we assume that we are essentially existing here as accidental organisms just competing in a struggle for survival with no endowed meaning or supervision. What might we expect to find? And I would ask what you would expect to find if we were created with purpose by a loving God who wants us all to come into communion with him, but for some reason thinks it's necessary that we exist in this vale of tears, in this material world first. What would you expect to find? I don't think. And then look at what you do find. Look at what you do find in the natural world. Even if you just take into consideration non-human animal suffering, just an unfathomable amount of negative experience
Right.
for seemingly no reason, not to mention the fact that children are getting cancer, as you say, and as you've already alluded to, there are evils that humans commit, like the Holocaust, but there are evils which they don't, like earthquakes and tsunamis and the like.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I don't think we would expect to see any of this if we assume that hypothesis. But if we assume that we are just accidentally existing organisms in a struggle for survival, not only do we explain this, but we also come to expect it.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it provides a much better explanation.
Here, Alex is making the claim that the world as we find it, with all its death, disease, and disasters, is more in line with a blind and accidental process, rather than a creation of an all-loving creator. But there is no reason to think that a blind and accidental process would or could generate any reality in the first place, especially a reality as seemingly stable as this one. The solidity of the world, if anything, lends itself to postulating some kind of intentionality behind it. That said, the moral ambiguity of nature does lend itself to suspicion. This is why the Gnostics came up with the idea of the demiurge and the world as a prison planet. The problem of evil is not actually an argument against the existence of God, but against the character of God, particularly against the God of love.
The thing that we are most fundamentally confronted with, I think, on an existential level, is suffering.
Mm-hmm.
And there's our own suffering, and then there's the suffering of others, and the seemingly meaningless suffering of a child who's undergoing cancer and does not survive it. And I'm told that in the face of such existential tragedy, I turn to religion to give us a sort of sense of fulfillment and a sense of explanation. But when asked about the mechanism of how, I'm told it's because at some undisclosed number of years ago, somebody committed a sin against God, and that's why your child has now died of cancer.
Here, Alex is presenting sort of a mischaracterization of the Christian response to the problem of evil. The original sin theodicy is rarely appealed to by any serious apologist, though the concept persists in various religious arguments. In both Western and Eastern traditions, the idea of sin or karma influencing your life or the world or future generations has been a relatively core dogma, but it is still the weakest and most unconvincing of the theodicies. The next clip is on the problem of animal suffering. Alex calls this the biggest problem for Christianity. Nearly all apologists agree that the problem of evil represents the greatest challenge to the tri-omni God, and the problem of evil already includes natural evil and animal suffering. So this is not that controversial of a claim. Alex's point, though, is that most theodicies do not address animal suffering, and many more animals have suffered for many more generations than humans, even if human suffering is categorically worse. But even that does not tip the scales. Meaninglessness, which is primarily, if not uniquely, a human experience, is vastly more problematic than suffering in general, and animal suffering in particular. That said, it is certainly still a problem. Let's see how William Lane Craig replies to it.
I think that the problem of animal suffering is particularly acute for those of us who love animals. It's anguishing to see the suffering that animals endure. And so I want to make 2 points about this, Sean. The first point is I would like to speak to the value and even the necessity of animal predation. Any viable ecosystem in which human beings can live is going to have to operate according to natural laws and will have to involve animal predation. Otherwise, the insects would eventually consume all the vegetation and everything would starve to death. So, animal predation is an essential part of a viable ecosystem. This was really interestingly illustrated recently by the decision of the Canadian government to reintroduce wolves into the wild in Canada. And the reason they did this was because, in the absence of these predators, the caribou herds were flourishing and overgrazing because there was nothing to kill off the sick and the aged. And as a result, the caribou were dying. They were starving to death. By introducing the wolves back into the ecosystem, this managed the size of the caribou herd so that they are now flourishing once again. So, ironically, it's such a tremendous irony. animal predation is actually good for the prey, like the caribou herds. So it is a vital part of a viable ecosystem in which we human beings can flourish.
The argument from animal predation is a problematic theodicy. Yes, in this particular kind of world we find ourselves in, animal predation can have beneficial effects for the species as a whole. But even if we could try to justify individual suffering for the good of the species, that still says nothing about why this predation system exists in the first place. William's appeal to natural law does not hold up. For God determines what is natural law, and why would a being of love create such a natural law as the food chain?
Now, the second thing that I wanted to say about animal predation is that we can ameliorate the degree of animal suffering by understanding what animals experience. There are different levels or thresholds of pain phenomena in nature. At the lowest level, there is simply aversive behavior to noxious stimuli. For example, if you poke an amoeba with a needle, it will recoil, not because it feels pain, but it's just programmed to instinctually react in that way to avert noxious stimuli. And the vast, vast majority of life on this planet is on this lowest level. It is only when you get to higher animals, say like the vertebrates, that you begin to have phenomenal pain awareness. Dogs and cats and horses and cows and so forth clearly experience pain. So they have a genuine experience of pain in their awareness. But they do not have as yet the third level, which is a self awareness of pain. Animals do not have a first person perspective whereby they can say, I am in pain or I feel pain. That is unique, so far as we know, to human beings. And that makes human suffering uniquely terrible because we not only feel pain, but we are aware of the fact that we are in pain. Whereas animals may be in pain, but they are not self-aware that they are themselves in pain. And so God, I think, in a sense, has shielded the animal world from the worst sorts of pain and suffering, which is unique to human beings.
Attempts to ameliorate the degree of perceived animal suffering doesn't really do anything for the argument. Even if, in the best case scenario, we can do away with 99% of what we assume to be the suffering of animals, we are all convinced that there is at least some animals that at least sometimes experience intense suffering. Why should there be even 1% of the gratuitous suffering of animals?
Now, this was not lost on C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis was an atheist early on in his life because he went through World War I, the terrible war. And for a while, he thought there can't be a good God because there's too much injustice in the world. And then one day he had an epiphany, and he wrote it in the book Mere Christianity. How many people in here have read Mere Christianity? Okay, if you haven't read Mere Christianity, consider yourself undereducated. You need to read Mere Christianity. And here's what Lewis said about that in the book Mere Christianity, basically that evil requires good and good requires God. Here's how he put it. He said, and as an atheist, my argument against God was that the universe seems so cruel and unjust. But how would I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? You see, there can't be a crooked line unless you know what a straight line is. You wouldn't know what injustice was unless you knew what justice was. Something can't be immoral unless something is. Something can't be not right unless something is. And that presupposes God. Otherwise, everything's just a matter of opinion. So, evil does not disprove God. It may show there's a devil out there, but it can't disprove God. You could look at it this way as well. The shadows prove the sunshine. In order to have shadows, you have to have sunshine. In other words, in order to have evil, you have to have good. Oh, you can have sunshine without shadows. You can have good without evil. But you can't have shadows without sunshine. You can't have evil without good. If evil exists, and everybody knows it does, then God must exist. Because if there is no God, that means there is no good, which means there is no evil.
The argument put forward by C.S. Lewis is not really defense against suffering. If you want to argue for the unjustness of the world in abstract, then you do need to appeal to some objective or at least consensual standard. But when we talk of the problem of evil, what we actually care about, much more than the logical problem, is the subjective and pre-reflective problem of suffering. Axiology comes before ethics. For a little puppy being beaten to death during the dog meat festival, that little puppy doesn't need to know anything about ethics or objective morality or God to know that it suffers. Suffering, like evil, is not like a shadow in that it requires good. Suffering is simply an incongruence between the desire of the conscious being and the experiential state they are in. Suffering, then, is not any evidence for God. And yet, there is something we can say about suffering. We suffer because we long for something else. Where did we get this longing? Plato calls this knowing or memory of another world anamnesis. The Hebrew Bible says God writes these truths on our hearts. So while suffering cannot be evidence for God, our rejection of suffering could be.
Is God good? If he is, why is there suffering and evil? Let's assume for the moment that God is all-powerful. This means that God can do anything that is logically possible. So he can create galaxies and subatomic particles and rainforests and you. But God cannot do what is logically impossible. He cannot make a square circle or a one-ended stick. So can God make a rock so big that he can't lift it? No. So what if, when God created human beings, he wanted them to be free? Freedom's a good thing, but if humans are to be free, they cannot be forced to obey God. Because freedom without choice is like a square circle. It's a logical contradiction. No choice, no freedom. God didn't want robots. He wanted real people. The first humans endowed with the awesome power of free choice abused their freedom. The tragic consequences of their bad choice and our bad choices ripple across the world. God is responsible for the fact of freedom, but humans are responsible for their acts of freedom.
Logic and reason do not precede reality. If God generates existence, God generates also logic and reason. If the religious person posits some condition prior to God, then it is not God they worship, but rather something like the law of non-contradiction. Now we can modify that and say that logic doesn't precede God, but is one of God's conditions. But then we are still left with a major flaw in this argument, and that is, why would evil and suffering and death be a necessary condition for free will? However free we might be, it is still a very arbitrary freedom. I am not free to make myself fly without some sort of contraption, and yet if I accidentally slip off a cliff, I might fall to my death. I could be just as free in a world where gravity did not include such a lethal condition. Similarly, free will does not necessitate a universe that has suffering and death as its core feature. Why should there be suffering in the first place? Why should existence allow for suffering when it does not allow for many other things? Why should suffering even be an option? Free will is not enough of an argument for suffering and death. While apologetics, despite its impassioned fervor, does not do justice to the problem of evil, one notable mention is John Lennox. He acknowledges that while he cannot offer a satisfactory answer to the problem of evil, his belief in the Christian worldview can tell us at least what the reason for evil is not. And it's not because God does not love us or does not suffer with us.